Good morning. This is Tom Scott, the Executive Director of SC Cyber, and I'd like to welcome everybody to today's lecture and webinar, which is part of our Cybersecurity Fall Lecture Series. Today we have the honor and the pleasure of our guest speaker, Mr. Mark Punzarudo. Mark is the Director of Security Consulting Services, and I could try and read his bio, but I don't think that I would do him justice, so I'll go ahead and let him tell you guys about himself. And today we're going to talk a little bit about compliance. Compliance tends to not necessarily be something that is sexy, not like penetration testing or hacking or other things like that, but it is a necessary evil in the business and the workplace. I will tell you guys something Mark will probably re-emphasize, that compliance does not mean that you are secure. It means that you are compliant. It means that somebody's given you some requirements and you can check off the box that, yes, we have these things in place. Doesn't necessarily mean that nobody will ever hack you. So let me go ahead and turn it over to Mark. Thank you again for joining us here and talking to our iTech 493 class. Mark Punzarudo.
All right, good morning, everybody. So as Tom mentioned, thanks for the great introduction. But I'm the Director of Security Consulting Services for an organization named ControlScan. We're headquartered out of Alpharetta, Georgia. We do managed security services, compliance auditing, security auditing companies, where that trusted third party comes in and gives you a separate set of eyes on what's going on in your environment. As far as my bio, I'll keep it real brief. I've been doing IT security at some grand scale for about 10 years, various companies from Applebee's International through other consulting firms. Worked for many global firms, done a lot of international work with Fortune 500, 100 companies, which gives you a unique perspective on how the world actually approaches compliance and security. If you have any questions, definitely don't hesitate to just reach out, let me know, and I'll have some time at the end for that as well. So today, compliance, what's it all about? So our agenda in general, we're going to talk about what is compliance, what does it mean, what's it for, why do we do it. I'm going to give you some common examples of compliance in the industry, as well as ramifications for being non-compliant, and show what the damage is. Ultimately, as Tom said, compliance is the act of complying, quite literally. So what are we doing? We have a set of laws, we have a set of rules, we have a set of controls that we have to follow because someone's telling us to. Think of compliance as your parents telling you to clean your room. They're telling you what the rule is. It's your job to do it. And if you don't, there's ramifications that come with that. At least there should be. There is in my house. But that is what compliance is all about. So Merriam-Webster, the act or process of complying to a desired demand or proposal. Simply means to follow instructions. Do what you're told. And these will be made available for you too, the slides, if you like. There's some good information in there that might be a decent reference for you in the future. So compliance and security are not equal, as Tom mentioned earlier. They are very separate concepts. There is absolutely no connection between the two. If you are compliant to something, you are not secure. You can be secure and be not compliant. You can harmonize these two things, though. It is possible to have them work together, which is, I think, what we strive to do with clients that we work with, and we hope that the industry does. Compliance should be a business as usual operation. It should be something where organizations understand what they have to do, and they're doing it every day, and they're being diligent about it, as well should their security program be. One issue right here I'd like to point out, compliance should be a business as usual, just as I mentioned. However, a compliance audit is only going to look at an organization at a specific point in time. So security is something your company is doing in order to protect itself, its clients, its data, its reputation. It is strategic direction set from a board or executive management. That's what a company owns. Compliance is a set of rules that somebody in the industry is making them do. So the trick is making both of those things work together. So everybody loves memes. So I try to throw in some mildly entertaining ones. Has anybody in here done any kind of software engineering, worked in industry? So you've worked in an industry. So this should ring true. So you got a cool solution, rush to production. Tell me again, how are you going to protect the data? Time to market is everything. It's 90% of what a business focuses on, especially in its early days. Why do we have compliance? Gene Wilder right here is why we have compliance. Organizations, simply put, cannot be relied on to follow necessary security precautions and rules. And that's not to say that organizations are unethical. That's not to say that they can't do it. It's to say that they have other focuses at time, like making money and paying employees and growing. So it's a mixed bag of responsibility, and compliance is there to enforce the necessary minimum standards in order to protect something. So we'll talk about what that something is here in just a second. So a few of the main factors in determining compliance. So the big ones, industry or vertical. If you're in healthcare, there's certain things you have to do to be compliant. If you're in manufacturing, there's certain things you have to do to be compliant. We're going to focus on data security and how compliance relates to IT specifically, but don't forget there's compliance of many types. OSHA has compliance standards. There's ISO standards for manufacturing. There's lots of different standards out there, lots of compliance. We're focusing on the technical stuff. Some of the other things, so type of data that you have. When you access certain types of data, there's certain requirements that are going to be pushed down on you in order to protect that data. Access to certain systems or types of data. That's really the second big, I would say, point of distinction when it comes to compliance. There are certain types of data and certain systems that when you access them, that are classified in such a way that you have to be compliant to a certain standard to use them. And we're going to see some really good examples of a few of the common compliance types coming up, and they'll make that real clear. Also contractual requirements. So we have things like payment card industry and agreed upon procedures, which are two of the bigger contractual requirements that are out there, and we'll dig into those as well. However, this is contract law, right? So this is, you are signing an agreement with another company, you are going to do X, Y, and Z. This is not legislation. I think one important takeaway from this is, and we'll see it on the next slide, is that you do have two very distinct types of compliance. Thinking through this, always remember, law, actual legislation, will always supersede contract law. So that's one of the things we're going to see here coming up. So types of compliance, we have regulatory compliance. So this is law, it's legislation. That's exactly what this is. I've got some common examples up here, but the big ones everybody's heard of, I would say HIPAA is probably the number one piece of regulatory compliance that I deal with on a day-to-day basis. Sarbanes-Oxley, SOX, also huge. GDPR has been in the news every day on my LinkedIn feed for the last probably 8-9 months, if not 20 or 30 times a day. And GLBA, those are, I would say, the more common examples, which applies to the banking industry and financial industry. So these here are actual pieces of legislation. There are defined laws on the books that say that you have to follow these. And you'll notice some of these examples are not in the United States. GDPR is not a standard in the United States. That's the UK and EU. And PIPEDA is Canada. So every country has their own set of regulatory compliance. So you can imagine how complicated it gets when you're working in a multinational company. You're dealing with Canada. You're dealing with the EU. You have China. You have other places in APAC, Australia. Every place has its own set of laws. So you have to follow all of them. And how do you map all those together? That's where really exciting people called compliance officers come into play. Half legal, half technical. They're kind of what I would refer to as a mutant in the field, for lack of a better term. But they live, eat, and breathe all this. Also, keep in mind, most every state, I believe there's 42 or 46 states have data security laws on top of it that are also regulatory compliance and have standards for things like incident response and breach protection, breach notification. I know everybody had a nice conversation about incident response. Was it the last seminar? So most every one of these standards contains incident response. All your state, all your federal ones, They all mention something about incident response, as well as insider threats are addressed by all the controls as well in all these standards, because those are obviously two very major portions of protecting data. Contractual compliance. So this is where you signed an agreement with somebody to say you're going to do something. You signed an agreement with Experian, for example, with one of the credit bureaus, to obtain data sets from them. That is, you agree to be compliant to something called the Experian Security Assessment Standard, or ESAS. Looks a lot like PCI DSS for the payment card industry, but you have to agree to follow that standard in order to get their data, or they shut you off. If you can't have a third party attest to that, they won't give you the data in the first place. Same thing, PCI DSS, very popular. It's been in the news for the last 6 to 8 years, real heavily. I mean, Target, Home Depot, everybody can name 10 credit card breaches off the top of their head these days. AUP is agreed upon procedures. SSAE 18, is anybody familiar with that? Or AT 101? How about SOC 1 or SOC 2? So you've heard. So SSAE 18 is the examination standard that results in a SOC 1 report. AT 101 results in a SOC 2. That's how that works. HITRUST is a healthcare security framework that is at best a contractual obligation between entities. So what it does is it takes something like HIPAA that's very verbose, it's legislation, so it's 60 pages that results in 150 pages of stuff you have to do. You almost need a lawyer to interpret parts of HIPAA and really understand it. What HITRUST does is it maps a bunch of security control requirements that come from NIST, ISO, other security standards. It maps them all together so that an organization can be both HIPAA compliant and compliant to other standards. There we go. I got confused. I looked at the other screen. Okay, so to go over a few types of compliance, right? What I want to drive home here is what are these common acronyms that you're going to hear? Compliance and data security are two industries that are unique in the world and how they have an acronym for everything. You almost have to have a degree in acronyms in order to fully understand all this. There are times, some of these I deal with 30, 40 times a day. Once in a while, I have to stop and remind myself what they actually stand for. It gets mildly confusing, to put it nicely. So to start out, PCI DSS. So this is a contractual obligation. This is a merchant or a service provider of some sort signs a contract with Card Brand or another organization, says we're going to do something with payment card information. That contract, the master services agreement or merchant services agreement, dictates in there you have to be compliant to this standard. So this is the one that protects payment card data. So when you see these breaches out in the news, this is the standard that everybody's looking at, saying how were you breached when you were compliant to this 3 months ago. This is that standard. Penalties, discretionary fines. So it's the most subjective fining mechanism that exists in the entire world, in my opinion. I've seen a whole lot of them, and we're going to see 4 more really good examples. The fines are completely discretionary from the banks, from the card brands. Depends on how non-compliant you are, kind of how they feel about your organization. There's a lot of things that get mixed in. But non-compliance penalties average $5,000 to $100,000 per month, depending on who you are and how long you've been non-compliant. And these come from the payment card brands and or sponsoring financial institutions. So this standard all about personal account numbers and sensitive authentication data. So anything that's written on your credit card or on the chips or the magnetic tracks. So examples. This is what happens when you're non-compliant to a standard or something happens that perhaps wasn't addressed in the security plan. Sonic, right here, everybody's most likely heard about this recently. Sonic is one of the newer breaches that's kind of been out. And that's not to say that they weren't compliant to the standard, but it is to say that they may have been able to do a better job in doing security. One does not preclude the other. One does not mean that you are going to be the other from security and compliance. What I'm trying to drive home here is the ramifications are not just financial. It's not just a fine, a fee. It is brand reputation. So I can tell you, as somebody who deals with this every day, including forensics and and everything that comes to follow from a payment card breach. When these incidents occur, I personally am not going to a Sonic for a little while. And I'm sure many people agree with me on that, and it's nothing that's to happen to anybody, but it's just what happens in a human brain when you see something like this in the news. Your first instinct is to protect your stuff because you don't want to mess with going to the bank, getting a new card, having fraud, having to take time off of work to figure it out. So human nature, you back up and say, maybe we'll skip going there for a little while until they figure all this out. And if 10% of the population who eats here does the same thing, what do you think happens to revenue numbers? Business's primary goal is to operate and make money. Sometimes security and compliance becomes difficult with that because they're trying to be profitable. What happens when your top line revenue disappears? That security sounds like a pretty good expense after that happens. So another big example, Home Depot, $25 million in their latest settlement. That doesn't include fees and fines from the card grants. So we're not talking about a couple dollars. SOX, Sarbanes-Oxley. Anybody familiar with SOX? Good for you guys. So Sarbanes-Oxley, this is regulatory compliance. This is a law. Sarbanes and Oxley were in the United States government. They were in Congress. That's where the name comes from. So this here is, anybody familiar with Enron or WorldCom? Heard of Enron?
Yeah, I've heard of WorldCom.
All right, so really interesting how one organization's mess up and being unethical not only made a regulation that applies to every publicly traded company in the United States, but many companies who interact with publicly traded companies. It's a very heavy piece of legislation. So this right here, with its main purpose is to protect shareholders and the public from fraud and enterprise. So in the Enron example that you guys have heard of, and WorldCom too, honestly, they're the same. Enron's big thing was they were an energy company at its core. That's what they sold themselves as. What they would do is they would consolidate billing from different utility companies. They'd pick up 100,000 accounts. Let's say that those 100,000 accounts netted them $1.5 million. They would charge those companies $1 million and do some funny work on the books so that it looked like they were super profitable. And they got all kinds of people investing in them. They were pulling in money left, right, and center. When someone pulled back the cover on the books, they realized not only was there no cash, there was negative cash. And everybody thought they were super profitable. Tons of people lost everything they had on that deal. So this is to protect people. And if you notice, the penalties here are very significant. So your C-level executives, if they submit inaccurate documentation, and notice I didn't say willfully submit inaccurate documentation or intentionally, if they submit an inaccurate audit report, 10 years in prison and a $1 million fine. And that is with no intentional negligence. Now, even better, corporate officers who collude in doing it, 20 years and $5 million. So you can see that the industry reacted very harshly to the Enrons and WorldComs, and they came up with a standard that was meant to really hold people accountable. And that we'll see in a second, the honest answer for compliance is holding people accountable. So examples, 15 years later, we're still talking about WorldCom and Enron and how it changed the industry. Those companies, have you ever heard of them anymore? Do you see them out in the world? No, they're gone. Long since gone. Multi-billion-dollar companies that disappeared literally overnight. HIPAA. This one's been in the news too about every other day. There's some kind of healthcare breach. All of our medical records are somewhere on the dark web. I think we have to just live with that, understand it. So Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. This is another piece of regulatory compliance. It ensures that there's a standard for protecting PHI or protected healthcare information, or ePHI if it's electronic. So that's if you go to a doctor's office, they have your electronic medical record, and what they refer to as EMR is your electronic medical record, and EHR, which is an electronic health record. So they have that in their software, and that allows that information to be transmitted not only to the insurance company without using paper, but it also allows them to port that information to other doctors who may need it. So let's say that you're going to Lexington Medical Center. Your record is in one of their offices. You go to the hospital, that hospital can pull the same record up like this instantly. There it is. If you go to another doctor outside of the system, and you go to Lexington Hospital, Lexington Hospital can contact their doctor's office and have your record sent over electronically. So it saves lives. I mean, moving healthcare information to electronic saves lives, saves time, saves lots of money. But that comes with a whole lot of issues, right? Securing data is not something that we're typically very good at. So penalties for this, $100 to $50,000 per violation or per record. I would encourage all of you to look up Anthem. If you look up Anthem breach and you just Google that, you will see the mind-boggling figures that pop up that they're paying. They're a Blue Cross Blue Shield subsidiary, or franchise, I should say, for Georgia. Repeat offenders, maximum penalty of $1.5 million a year per violation per record. So you can really see how those numbers would add up very quickly, and especially when there's issues like gross negligence and other things that take place, people aren't doing their due diligence, the fines are going to be large. They're punitive because they're meant to make people pay attention. So some examples. So we have the HHS Wall of Shame, worth Googling. If you ever want to know, has somebody been breached in healthcare and it's been reported? The HHS Wall of Shame is when health organizations who have breaches of over 500 records have to report it to HHS. They go on this wall. So you can actually go there in near real time, and you can look. You can search by location, you can search by state, you can search by type of breach, whether it's insider theft, external actors, someone lost a laptop, whatever it might be. This is always good for a quick view. It's interesting. You'd be surprised to see some organizations you're very familiar with on that list, I'm sure. They're everywhere. Anthem. So I was just talking about this $115 million is the settlement that is not talking about the fines and fees that they pay on the other hand. So if you can imagine operating a business, you feel like everything's going great. You're making all this money, hand over fist, big insurance company. You're looking at merging with the likes of the other large insurance companies that you hear of, Aetna, Cigna, so on and so forth. You're playing in that ballpark, and you get a bill for $115 million. Doesn't really matter how big your company is. That stings. You're in some trouble. BSA. So this is not often talked about. Anybody have any banking experience or financial institutions? No? So Bank Secrecy Act, another piece of legislation. You notice a lot of these are legislation. Contractually speaking, there's a handful of standards that usually fall into that category. Most compliance is dictated by some form of legislation. But BSA is all about anti-money laundering. So if you can imagine, at one point before Bank Secrecy Act was enacted, banks weren't required necessarily to have rules in place to stop people from laundering money through their banks. What AML does, and that's how this is referred to in the industry. So if you're out there on LinkedIn looking at jobs and you see someone say AML, they're saying that you need to understand anti-money laundering, which is part of the Bank Secrecy Act. It means that banks have to analyze everything that's going on in their transaction history and keep records to make sure that they are able to detect money laundering to the best of their ability. Penalties. You don't hear about these too often in the news because there's a very standard way to approach this, and banks take it very seriously. Inaccurate record keeping. So you forget, let's say that you have a process in place and you forget to store some records that are going to support the fact that you have a BSA AML program in place. It's $20,000 per incident. So let's say that you mess up 10 times over the course of a week. That's $200,000 real quick. Failure to register. So there is a registrar for BSA AML compliance. You have to go online and submit your documentation and your records. Just forgetting to do that on time is $8,000. And then willful violations. So let's say you're intentionally taking a shortcut. You're deploying a new technology. It's not quite ready. You don't have the AML monitoring and fraud detection built into it yet. Maybe some of the necessary reporting. But because time is money and time to market's really important, you decide to move forward while you're deploying the rest of it. It can be up to $215,000 for doing that in fines. So example, HSBC is probably the bigger example. They did the right thing actually when they went before Congress. The exact words from HSBC is we need to do better. So it's really one of the only big examples, with the exception of Banamex. So Banamex USA, a company most of you probably have not ever heard of, but I would encourage you looking up their company profile. They're significant. They forfeited $97 million because they violated this act. If they can't prove that money wasn't laundered, they can't legally have it. So if you can imagine $97 million, that's another huge, huge chunk of change. Even for a multi-billion-dollar company, $97 million of cash is bottom line. So that's an extremely large number. GLBA, Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. So this is privacy of client data. This isn't anti-money laundering. This is another thing that applies to financial institutions. GLBA compliance is very important for anybody who touches any kind of banking records, company financial records. You can imagine what the damage would be to an organization if your banking records for your company ended out on the internet. Starting, ending balances, account numbers, EINs, very difficult thing to come back from. So you can also see that the penalties are extreme, just like we saw with SOX. And it's one of the reasons that banks take this very seriously. Just like with Sarbanes-Oxley, we saw there were a lot of legal penalties where people are going to jail. It's also why publicly traded companies have massive internal audit departments, is to meet that standard. So the penalties for this, civil penalty of up to $100,000 per violation, which can also be individual. Organizations, officers, and directors are personally liable for $10,000. So your organization gets hit for $100. The officers of the company who are directly responsible for this violation get hit with $10,000 personally. I don't know about anybody in here, but I cannot pull out my wallet and drop $10,000 on the table. Not even close. So additional institutional and personal fines and or up to 5 years in prison. So USC is United States Code, so this is federal law. Just like with SOX, guess who Gramm, Leach, and Bliley are? They were Congress. They put the act on the table, and just like most acts in Congress, they have a little bit of an ego, and they attach their name to it. That's exactly how it all works. When you see a bunch of last names in a standard of any kind, I can almost guarantee you it's legislation, and I can almost guarantee you that the names are people from Congress. So, big example. There's one huge example in this space. So, Nationwide Mortgage. I'm not sure if anybody's really familiar. This is going back about 10 years, give or take. Nationwide Mortgage used to be one of the biggest mortgage lenders in the United States. Have you heard of them today? Have you seen any of their ads? Not Nationwide Auto, but they used to do mortgages. Have you heard of Nationwide Mortgages? You're right, because they closed their doors after this happened. So this was such a significant issue that you no longer know who they are. They're now they were split off into multiple pieces and bought by other mortgage companies after it was done because they weren't able to sustain business. So I'm still not 100% sure what the actual dollar amount was, but they did not protect their clients' data as the bottom line. They were not compliant to the standard. All right, so another meme here. I don't always cause an action, but when I do, it provokes a reaction, which is really what I'm trying to drive home with the compliance issue or the compliance discussion. There's an action, and that is I'm going to accept data of a certain kind. I'm going to access certain systems, and I'm going to agree to follow a standard. So my action is following the standard or choosing not to follow the standard. There's a reaction for both of those two. Just like in life, there's consequences to every action. So if you are compliant to a standard, do what you're supposed to do. The reaction is business as usual. If you are not doing what you're supposed to do and you get caught not doing what you're supposed to do, there is a definite consequence to those actions. So when you think of compliance, one of the big things, security versus compliance, compliance has a defined punitive outcome for not doing it. Security is something your company is going to do. They're going to define a strategic plan. They're going to do their best to protect what they know is important. Security is more cultural. It's more of an internal policy, I would say. Compliance is your parents grounding you for getting an F on a test. So non-compliance leads to reputational and financial damages. People are in the news every day for something compliance related. The field is not going away. I've been doing it myself now for about, I'd say seriously, about 6 to 7 years. And compliant requests for help with compliance have doubled literally every single year. Compliance and data security are two fields that are really exciting to be in right now because they change every day. Of course, I'm going to tell you data security is probably a little more fun, a little more exciting. Compliance is still a great place to hang your hat at the end of the day. So any questions? Come on, you got to have something.
Can you go back one slide?
Yeah.
Is that Sir Isaac Newton?
It is.
Okay. Do you guys know why?
Third law of motion.
Okay.
Yeah. Newton's third law.
Yeah.
For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Compliance, not necessarily following that. It's not always equal. It's not always equal. It is always opposite. I would say it's Newton's fourth law, as it relates to compliance, if you had one, would be for every action, there is a horribly unequal and much larger reaction than you would anticipate.
I guess my question would be, does any of these standards like change over time? And if so, like how much time do companies have to readjust?
That's a really good question, actually. So yes, every one of these standards changes. Now laws, as we know, laws get passed because they're voted on. And then if you want to amend a law, it takes a lot of time. So you will see most of the laws, what they do is they reference third-party publications within the government. So for example, GLBA is the FFIEC. So that organization, along with the FDIC, determine if changes are necessary. So when we think about emerging technologies, right now you can bank from your phone. But when this came out, phone banking didn't exist. So they do have publications which amend the standard because the law has a stipulation there. It says, do this plus do whatever they recommend in the future. So there are amendments that happen over time. Like for example, I'll talk about PCI because I deal primarily in payment card security. That's I would say our organization's core business. We definitely do authentic security and data security. A lot of it is in the payment card space. So the payment card standard really came to be about 10 years ago, maybe going on 12 years ago now. Before that, every card brand had their own standard. You were auditing yourself 4 or 5 times a year. And that's why you'd see organizations that would accept MasterCard and Visa and never touch Amex 10, 15 years ago. It's because you had whole different standards you had to follow. It's evolved. So about 10 years ago, the payment cards brands got together and said, let's make one standard. Stop messing around with all this nonsense with everybody having their own. They made one standard. It was 1.0. Then they went to 1.2. So it's a point release. If you're familiar with software engineering, it's a minor revision. They did the minor revision to keep up with the time. Then it went to 2.0. So it's a major release, probably about 3 years later. 3 years after that, 3.0 came out. So they went to a whole other standard. And now we're at 3.2. which is another 2-point releases have come out since then, and in about 3 more years we'll be at 4.0. So they do evolve these standards constantly, and it's not just because of emerging technologies, but also over time enough smart heads read the standard and they find errors, they find things that need clarification, they find loopholes, they find everything. So all of these definitely have guidance, and dealing with compliance is a full-time job.
So, Mark, the second part of Johanse's question was related to time. So, Graham Leach, Bliley, SOX, one of these standards, they make a change from a 3.0 to a 3.1. How long does his company have to make sure they're in compliance with that standard?
So usually when they make changes, it varies a lot depending on who's enacting it. When it comes to let's look at legal, right? So some of the bigger ones that Tom just mentioned, SOX and things of that nature. When they make amendments where they make clarifications or guidance documents, there's typically 12 to 18 months to really start putting those into effect. But if there's major changes, like in the case of payment card industry stuff, when they make major changes, it's going to be very difficult for companies to do. Let's take everybody familiar with SSL? Heard of it? TLS. It's what's encrypting. It's a transport protocol that takes care of and protects data over HTTPS. So when SSL v3 was found to have a critical vulnerability, it was no longer good for protecting sensitive data. Organizations have had 3 years right now, more or less, to get rid of it because it's in everything. It's in embedded devices. It's in Internet of, think of the Internet of Things. How do you go ensure that some box that someone bought from you 3 years ago doesn't have it? So it really depends on the organization implementing the standard, and it also depends on the complexity of the implementation. They do take that kind of thing seriously because if the entire industry was to push back, for example, and say we can't meet this standard in 6 months, it's impossible for us to do it, no one's going to follow it all. So there is a little bit of give and take there. And a lot of these standards are things, too, that I didn't touch on here at all. I didn't want to go too far in the weeds and bore you with all the details, but there are ways to compensate for some of those issues. Like I mentioned, SSL v3, it is possible to compensate and put a different control in place to protect that so that it is adequate. So it starts to get very complicated, but the short answer is typically a year to two, and it depends. Which it depends is the most common phrase in all of compliance, my least favorite one to use. However, it does depend.
Any other questions? Okay, so questions for you guys. Does security equal compliance? No. If I have two options, to follow the law or to follow the standard, which one supersedes? The law.
So very important distinction. I can't stress it enough. It's been the answer to many questions where we've had 30 or 40 people working on the same issue. And at the end of the day, we've sat back and said, wait a minute, this law is telling you to do one thing. Your contractual requirements telling you to do something else. Public law supersedes contract law every single time in the United States.
Okay, thank you. And Mark, these are tending to not be product pitch oriented, but I don't know much about Control Scan.
Sure. Yeah, I tried to leave the sales pitch at home. I wanted to teach you guys a little something. But so we're a global managed services company. That is the core of our business. We started in payment processing.
What is managed services?
So managed security services. Okay. We do managed firewalls. We do managed wireless access points and switches. So a lot of managed IT infrastructure. We also manage web application firewalls. We have internal and external vulnerability scanning that companies can utilize, as well as log management and monitoring. So we utilize a platform called LogRhythm, if anybody's familiar with that. We buy a bunch of licenses, more or less, so that we can supply it downstream at a more reasonable cost point for companies who maybe couldn't afford to take such enterprise technology and put it in their rack. And then we manage it for them. We have the subject matter experts that are trained on it, and endpoint protection as well. So we'll do a managed endpoint protection offering. So we can come in and do some interesting bundles to help companies with projects, or whether it's compliance or security related. We can bundle these products together, help implement, help manage, support the organization, what they're doing. Okay. My side of the company, so I direct the security consulting services side. We are the bodies who are consulting. I mean, for lack of a better term, I believe you had someone in here talking about security consulting a couple times ago. The core of that side of the business is, one half of it is penetration testing, ethical hacking, web application security and vulnerability analysis, social engineering, things of that nature. The other side of the business is audit and assurance, which is where my background is, honestly. I can talk to penetration testing, but I wouldn't sell it to you if I was doing it myself. We've got way smarter people that work for me to do that. My primary focus is audit and assurance. PCI DSS. We're a qualified security assessor firm. It means we're registered with the PCI Council and the card brands to go do third-party audits on payment security. We perform a lot of advisory with organizations that are trying to lessen compliance burdens so they can focus on security. So we're really familiar with a lot of emerging technologies in that space and have tons of partners with financial institutions. We also do healthcare compliance, ISO 27001, advisory and readiness work. So we do a lot of general security work with a heavy focus in payment cards.
Okay. Mark, a couple last questions for me. So all of these guys here and gals in the class are juniors, seniors, and will be moving into the workforce soon. So do you guys do internships, or are you successful lately enough to be hiring?
I will tell you this, take my card when you leave and let me know when you're done.
Where are y'all based out of?
So our office is now Alpharetta, Georgia. I live in Lexington. My whole team is 100% remote. So the nature of security consultants, it's always remote access, or in the case of penetration testing, if it's external work, we could sit in our house and work on that. We don't need to be in an office doing it. If it's internal, we have devices that we ship out so that we can do a reverse SSH tunnel back to our lab where we can remote access into and do the work. So a lot of it's remote. From the audit and assurance work, we're on site with clients typically every other week for 3-4 days at a time. So it's a little bit travel intensive from time to time, maybe 30-40% travel. Really exciting. You know, it's really exciting when you get out of college and get into a job like that. Audit and assurance is a very hard field to get into because it typically requires certifications that need at least 5 years experience. So to be a QSA, I mean, well, I can't really show it up. I have no way to show, but so to be a PCI QSA, for example, you have to have 2 5-year certs. CISM, CISA, CISSP, ISO 27001 lead auditor. You have to have a selection, you have to have at least 2. So it's a difficult cert to obtain, as are all the ones I just mentioned for that matter because of experience. But we certainly encourage all of you to reach out and let's have that conversation when you're ready.
Right. So following up on that, you talked about having multiple certifications to get other qualifications. One of the things that the quote I hear is, which of you is going to put an 18-year-old in charge of your network? And there's not any companies that I know that are going to do that.
I've worked for one.
for these students that are getting ready to enter the workforce, what is your best Markism that you can leave with them as suggestions of ways to maybe more rapidly enter the workforce or more successfully enter the workforce?
So I did it the hard way. You guys are doing it not the hard way right now, at least different path, right? I would say if I was in your position, getting into consulting is probably the best way to learn as much as possible, as quick as possible, and to work with some very bright minds that have been doing it for a long time who are going to teach you tons. 3 to 5 years in consulting out of college is definitely going to set you up for a very nice position anywhere you want to go. Like I give you a little background on myself. So I was in the military, got out of the military, ended up working as a dishwasher and a cook at an Italian restaurant. That translated into Applebee's. I ended up moving up the food chain with them, ended up working on IT project management, development, support, eventually their compliance efforts for payment card security. So I worked up through that, and it was a hard path to do it that way. Then I got into consulting, and my career literally went from, here I am kind of staying flat, barely moving up. I got into consulting, and it jumped up 300-fold within a year.
So along those same lines, I'm not going to hire an 18-year-old to run my network. Who's going to hire a 22-year-old to be a consultant?
A lot of people. A lot, because so consulting, you're selling people's time. And this isn't to talk about the monetization of security consulting, but honestly, it's a business. So we're always looking for eager minds that are smart and can pick this stuff up, where we can utilize them on a project, grow them over time, because hiring people who've been doing it for 20 years is rather expensive. So you hire seniors and principals who just are really sharp and know it, and you hire juniors to work with them, and you work with these people who know not everything, but they think they know everything. They know a lot. You will become a prima donna. A little bit of a joke. You will become a prima donna if you go into consulting, because you will know more than a lot of other people. You'll be just the sheer nature of the job you're exposed to I would say I'm exposed to about 450 clients a year, and every one of them has a different approach to how they're doing some of this. So I've done about 200 and I can't keep track, but let's say around 200 to be conservative payment card assessments, a lot of them at large companies. And in doing so, almost every technology you can name that's enterprise, I've had my hands on, I've seen, I've worked with. There's not a lot that people surprise me with anymore. I do learn something new every day. You're never going to know it all. But as far as just, what is it they say about the CISSP? It's an inch deep and a mile wide. That's what happens over time. I mean, you name the products. ArcSight, QRadar, LogRhythm, those are three major SIM platforms for log and event management, security, incident, and response. In most people's lifetime working with a private company, you'll be lucky to be exposed to one, and you may or may not actually have your hands on it. As a consultant, you're going in reviewing standards that cover everything from incident response to log management, monitoring, alerting, through access controls, role-based access controls, so LDAP servers, Active Directory, email servers, Exchange, mainframes, which is something that's extremely difficult to get your hands on these days unless you're in a certain industry. But you get your hands on mainframes, work with mainframe operators, DBMS operators, database admins, so Oracle, Teradata. I mean, there's just the amount of technologies that you're exposed to on a day-to-day basis is mind-boggling. And I really think at, say, 18 is a little rough, but let's say 20 to 24, perfect time to get into consulting. It's a great job for people who want to travel, want to learn a lot real fast, and want to get established.
Isn't that kind of like joining the Army?
Yeah, it pays way better.
Okay.
It pays way better in the Army.
All right. Mark, we are getting close to 10:30 in our wrap-up time, and I know I've got several students that have other classes right after this. So how about a little round of applause for Mark? Great job. Thank you again for coming and spending some of your time and sharing some of your insight with my students today. I'd like everyone to know that we will continue with our fall webinar series next week, November 3rd. However, instead of starting at 9:30, we will start a little bit later. Please check the SC Cyber website for the exact time. As always, we are recording these sessions and they're available on our website. So if you are not able to attend in person, you are able to log in and view the presentation afterwards. If you found something you thought of value today, please share the recording with a colleague or a friend. And once again, Mark, thank you so much for your expertise, your insight, and your valuable contribution to the profession and my class. So
thanks for having me.
Yes, all right, everyone, we're going to wrap up. Have a great Friday and a great weekend.